Good morning and welcome to this CSIS event. My name is Ryan Berg. I'm the director of the Americas program here at the center, and I also head the Future of Venezuela initiative here at the center. On September 2nd, the United States carried out a kinetic strike against a suspected drug-laden vessel in the Caribbean. Since then, the U.S. military has targeted at least 10 boats, killing 43 as it ramps up its counter-narcotics campaign in the southern Caribbean, recently expanding that campaign to the Pacific with 2 strikes as well. This campaign has been enabled by a massive buildup of force in the Caribbean. We want to show some images here on the screen for viewers. The campaign has been enabled by this massive military buildup in the Caribbean, and now I'm only going to highlight some of the top line numbers here. 10,000 troops, 4 U.S. Navy destroyers, 2 amphibious vessels, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, the MV Ocean Trader, which is a retrofitted commercial ship that serves as a floating special operations vessel, 10 F-35Bs, 8 Harriers, many Black Hawk and Little Bird helicopters. And here on this next image from the New York Times, you can see as of about a week ago where some of these items were last seen in the theater. And most recently, we have seen this deployment supported by aircraft launched from the United States. And here I will show an image from SA Defensa, an excellent open source analyst whom folks who are interested should definitely follow. These B-52s, which 2 weeks ago had hours of flight time near Caracas after taking off from Louisiana. And last week, several B-1s flew for hours near Venezuela before returning to base. Here we have another image from Ian Ellis Jones showing here the flight path from the United States to quite near Venezuela. And lastly, on Friday of last week, the Pentagon announced the intention to bring the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. There's an image of that, again, from our friend SA Defensa. And its escort vessels, the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group and its escort vessels to the Caribbean from its current theater in EUCOM, carrying up to 90 additional aircraft, obviously a massive increase in U.S. firepower in the region. That panorama makes the current U.S. military buildup one of the largest naval buildups in the Caribbean in decades. And I will put up one more image here before we get started. This is from our own CSIS Defense and Security Department team, comparing both with the Carrier Strike Group and currently today what the naval assets in the region look like, both at the current moment and historically vis-a-vis the Panama invasion, the Grenada invasion in '83, and Operation Desert Storm. So is this a counter-narcotics campaign? Is this a pressure campaign against the Nicolas Maduro regime in Venezuela? What are the possibilities, and there are certainly many, with this equipment and these number of vessels and aircraft in the southern Caribbean? To answer these questions, we have 2 superlative panelists with us this morning, both in-house CSIS experts, to help us unpack all of this. First, seated directly across from me, I'm joined by Juan Cruz, who's a senior advisor with the Americas program here at the center, where he previously served as well as the head of the Argentina-US Strategic Forum. He has a long history of service throughout Latin America, finishing his career in the U.S. government as the Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council during the first Trump administration. Among other things, he was instrumental in defining the administration's approach to Venezuela and overall Western Hemisphere strategy. And next to him, we have Mark Cancian, who's a retired U.S. Marine Corps colonel, currently Senior Advisor with the CSIS Defense and Security Department. Previously, Mark worked at the Office of Management and Budget as Chief of the Force Structure and Investment Division, working on issues such as DoD budget strategy, war funding and procurement programs, as well as nuclear weapons development and nonproliferation activities in the Department of Energy. In the military, Colonel Cancian spent over 3 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, active and reserve, serving as an infantry, artillery, and civil affairs officer, and an overseas tours in Vietnam, Operation Desert Storm, and twice in Iraq. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here. This is an important event. It's a timely event. Mark, maybe I'll start with you and then go to Juan. Let's start macro and then let's zoom in to some of the issues with Venezuela. But let's start macro with the national defense strategy, with the national security strategy having been drafted, so we hear, waiting for the public versions of those documents to come out. The strategies will supposedly prioritize the Western Hemisphere and homeland defense as the decisive theaters. How can these deployments, how can the current deployment and the current force posture in the Western Hemisphere be seen in light of those changing foreign and defense policy priorities?
Well, these deployments would be consistent with that view of national defense. The original interim national defense strategy emphasized the Western Pacific, identified Taiwan as the driving scenario. This is different. This focuses on homeland security, hemispheric security. So having such a large force in the Caribbean would be consistent with that. And if this force is going to stay there for any length of time, and it looks like it will, then it will put a lot of strain on the Navy. The Navy will have to make trade-offs. The administration would like to pull forces out of Europe and the Middle East to focus on the hemisphere, but they may have to pull some forces back from the Pacific to keep this large deployment going for a length of time.
Juan, let's turn to you. How do you fit this current deployment within the NDS, the NSS, which we hear are currently drafted at this point and waiting to be released? How do you see it historically? You've served in the region for a long time.
Hello, Ryan, and thanks for having me, including me on this timely discussion. I think what we're seeing, quite frankly, we're witnessing the evolution of what will be a new Trump counter-drug strategy in the region. The emphasis on the Western Hemisphere will really reflect an America first foreign policy. In that case, we shouldn't make the mistake of just throwing the whole hemisphere behind the interests of the administration. I think that, in fact, what we're looking at is those things that most interest the administration, migration, counter-drug and security, China, critical minerals, those sorts of things. What we're seeing is a manifestation of, or an evolution of the Trump 1 administration's view on the seriousness that the president takes the battle against drugs and now the labeling of narco-terrorists and doing something about it. So I think that what we're really witnessing is a reframing and a redefinition of our strategy and our policy towards counter-narcotics and how we're going to combat drugs in the region.
Juan, I want to stick with you for a second. As we've seen this buildup in the Southern Caribbean, we've seen the importance of Puerto Rico as part of stationing. We've seen old bases that haven't been operating for a long time reopened, such as Roosevelt Roads in La Ceiba, which I think was decommissioned in 2004. And so Puerto Rico has clearly emerged as a major node in U.S. power projection, in being able to have this amount of force posture in the Southern Caribbean. Juan, you were born in Puerto Rico. You know the island very, very well. What kind of military infrastructure is in existence, and what are the types of deployments it can sustain? What does this tell us about, if anything, about the long-term viability of the deployment? And before you answer, for our listeners, I'm going to put up on the screen an interesting graphic that we put together, the CSIS Americas program, showing sort of the range of U.S. Equipment, some of them, from a notional point midway between Puerto Rico and Venezuela.
Ryan, as a Puerto Rican, I'm thrilled to see the island recover some of the roles and responsibilities it had for a long, long time in the defense of our nation. In the case of Puerto Rico, I would say we have 4 facilities that are being currently used. It's important to note, as you've said, Roosevelt Roads Naval Station was closed down in 2004 as a part of the BRAC, Congress's base realignment and closure program. It's tremendously unfortunate. because it has natural deep water ports for submarines. It has these, airstrips. It includes an 11,000-foot airstrip in Roosevelt Roads. Roosevelt Roads, just to put it into some context and how fast we've been able to recover our capabilities there. It's in the eastern part of the island. It's in Ceiba. It was turned over to the government of Puerto Rico that subsequently turned it over to the municipality of Puerto Rico. It's laid largely fallow. There's no real use to the base except for the airstrip and what was a municipal airport on that side of the island. And you can imagine restoring it. And it's important to note, it's not a military base. It's been, fashioned very quickly to be able to support the bulk of our air platforms that are in the theater. And then we have secondarily Muñiz Air Base, which is Puerto Rico Air National Guard base that shares the principal international airport at San Juan. That one has received some interesting aircraft as well, usually larger aircraft. And then you have on the opposite side of the island, on the west, in Aguadilla, Jose Aponte de la Torres Airport. Again, a civilian airport, but it used to be a SAC base during the Cold War. So a SAC-based Strategic Air Command, so think bombers with nuclear weapons. It was decommissioned in the 70s, so well before then, but it still held some presence by U.S. law enforcement. And not to get into too many details, DEA's had a presence there for a long time. And for those of you who may recall the counter-drug operations led from over-the-horizon radar, these big sort of blimps with a radar that are tethered and run in conjunction with the U.S. military, precisely pointed towards Venezuela back in the 90s, were also run from this base. So that was Ramey Air Force Base. And then lastly, the civilian port of Ponce, which has had a lot of support for our naval vessels coming in that's in the southern or southwest part of the island. So the totality of it is very interesting. I actually was raised in Fort Buchanan Army Base, which is one of the few standard bases that still exist in Puerto Rico.
Fantastic. Thank you for that panorama, Juan. Mark, I want to go to you with a similar question. You've noted in some of the pieces that your program has put out on this that the U.S. is now starting to rotate vessels. It's now starting to rotate forces. What does that tell you about the long-term nature of this deployment, or the intention at least to make it a long-term deployment? One of the questions we were all asking when this force buildup was happening was, what's the sustainability of this? What's the medium and long-term viability of this? And I think in a couple of pieces that you've published, you've made the argument that this appears to be a long-term type of deployment. At least the administration is making moves that would support that type of argument.
Well, that's right. When the operation began, we weren't sure where it would go. One possibility was that this force would melt away over time as ships had to return to port, somewhat like what happened with the deployment to Los Angeles. The administration sent a lot of troops in there, but over a couple of weeks, most of those went home, and the total deployment declined. That has not happened with the naval deployments in the Caribbean.
In fact, it's increased. The New York Times is now reporting that it's 10,000. Publicly, we had about 6,000, 6,500 as one of our best guesses. And then the DoD confirmed that, in fact, there are more troops in theater and that they just hadn't announced some of their arrivals.
Well, that's right. When we did our calculation with the forces we knew about, we came to about 7,000.
Okay.
And I think with some of the additional forces that are now clear, that would get up to about 10,000. But with the naval forces, there are 9 ships on station now, excluding the carrier, which is en route. We were wondering whether, as ships had to return to port at the end of their deployment time, whether they would be replaced or whether the force would just shrink. The ships have been replaced. At least 2 of them have been replaced. That tells us that this deployment is going to go on for some time, that as ships go back to port, when their time is up, another ship will replace them. And as I noted, that will require trade-offs in other theaters because the Navy is badly stretched as it was before this additional commitment.
Mark, let me stick with you as well. Another question sort of on the long-term nature of this deployment. We put out a piece last week on the joint task force that was announced on counter-narcotics. One made a point about its shifting paradigm on counter-narcotics that the administration is keen to implement. What does that say to you about the long-term nature of this deployment? What's the role of the joint task force on counter-narcotics? And one thing that caught many of our attentions was that the joint task force will be run out of the second expedition, the Marine Expeditionary Force unit. I think you have some thoughts on why it might be stationed there, why it might be focused there as opposed to in another unit at another location.
Well, this was an interesting development. On the one hand, it's not unusual that when a large operation occurs, the regional combatant commander will stand up a joint task force to focus on that operation so that the regional commander can focus on the whole region, not just a particular operation. And Southcom is a relatively small headquarters by regional standards, so the level of operations may have stretched them and required a joint task force. What was interesting is that it was the Marines that are forming the nucleus. Now, this will be a nucleus because it's a joint task force. There will be service members from other services and also many from civilian agencies and Homeland Security and the intelligence community. It may just be that the 2MEF was the largest and most handy headquarters, but it seemed to me that if the expected operations were going to be primarily naval, as they've been so far, interdicting vessels, that building this headquarters around a naval headquarters might have made more sense. If there were going to be an air campaign against Venezuela, then building it around Air Force headquarters might have made more sense. The fact that it's the Marines who specialize in amphibious warfare, that is going from the sea onto the land, it might indicate that the future would have some sort of power projection.
Very interesting. Juan, I want to go to you for a question on what we've been calling here at CSIS optionality. There's a lot of things that this particular force deployment can do. As Mark mentioned, there's amphibious capability. One of the first slides we put up, there's definitely a lot of air power out there. There's a lot of sea power out there. So you've got a bunch of different capabilities. And the two narrative poles, at least as it's been interpreted here in Washington, are that either this is a counter-narcotics campaign or this is some kind of campaign with intent to push the Maduro regime out of power in Venezuela. Those are the two poles on the continuum as I see them. But the current force posture, as we know, provides a lot of opportunities in between, right? A lot of options, a lot of different things with all those capabilities. Can you describe, as you see it, the evolution of this mission as we've been watching it unfold over the last 7 or so weeks? Where are we on that continuum?
Ryan, this all started in late August, so a lot has happened in that period of time. I think it was 19 or 20 August when it was first announced that we were embarking on this naval expansion in the Southern Caribbean to control drugs. And it wasn't until the 1st of September that we had the first strike against an identified drug boat. And then, but through that narrative, we still weren't talking about Venezuela specifically. Exactly. That crept up on us. And then it became its own issue. And now, as you point out, it appears to be the primary issue. And so, I thought about a lot about this issue, whether, is it drugs, is it narco terrorism, is it regime change? And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, because if your objective is, if you've already labeled Nicolas Maduro, $50 million price on his head, involved in these activities, he is both the leader of that country and a narco-terrorist. And so, in some ways, it really doesn't matter. Where it matters is on the ground and what you want to achieve and what the end game is. We have to be careful about ascribing our own definition to what the administration is saying is some of our objectives. I believe that is in total evolution. as we have morphed, as we've evolved over our initial deployment to where we are now, it lends to permanence to what we're doing, and it may be a lot more than about Venezuela. And some people discuss, is this a decapitation strategy? Is this a means to remove Maduro and exact regime change? Maybe. I think the administration is leaving its options open. I think some of the administration are arguing that this is an opportunity to achieve a lot more than when we first set out to do. And others saying, well, hold on a second. What is that we really want to achieve? And what's an America First objective here? Which is, quite frankly, the president is a huge believer in stopping those things that kills his own citizens, the people that elected him, and the people that he needs to protect. And that's a far cry from regime change. So I think there's a sort of a scale there, and you can achieve both objectives or just one.
You bring up a good point, which is of course the fact that the regime itself is involved in illicit economic activities. Narcotics is only one of them, we should note. Obviously there's illegal gold mining, human trafficking, sundry activities that are taking place in Venezuela on the illicit side of the ledger, much of which the regime has some kind of hand in. And so you could argue that counter-narcotics is tantamount to removing up to and including individuals who are leading countries or in control of the security apparatus of a country and yet still involved in these activities. Mark, I want to ask you a question, but first I want to put a slide up on the screen, which is a very interesting graphic that your program has done, the Defense and Security Department. You estimated, insofar as this is a counter-narcotics campaign, the rough area of constant surveillance that we think the U.S. military has on vessels embarking from Venezuela. This is a rough estimate here, but your theory is that the military is catching them soon after they launch, right? So that they don't have to look in open water. And so insofar as this is a counter-narcotics campaign, I think it's a really interesting graphic which estimates this area of constant surveillance. But where do you fall on this question of the continuum? Where are we on the continuum? How do you see the evolution of the mission here in the Southern Caribbean?
Well, we clearly started with a counter-drug mission and had assets that were at least reasonably well adapted for that. But over time, we've seen an evolution both of the rhetoric and of the forces that would indicate more of more capability for some sort of strike at the Venezuelan government. The assets could be used to strike cartel facilities. For example, we have something like 180 Tomahawks, we estimate, in the naval forces. Those could strike either cartel production facilities, for example, or the Maduro regime. But in terms of invasion, and I know we have a slide on that, we don't have the forces to do that yet. And here is the slide. And on the left there, you see what we have, and on the right is a minimum that would be needed for regime change.
Right.
And that is to take out the Maduro regime, maybe capture Caracas. It's not enough to occupy the entire country. It would be enough to install an opposition government. And this is a minimum because the war planners, which I was once in a previous life, would want something on the order of 150,000 to get the overwhelming force that they like in these operations.
And that we should note the chart that I've now put on the screen, also from Mark's program, Defense and Security Department here at CSIS. This is based on doctrinal estimates, but also the figure in terms of the number of troops in theater is slightly lower than what has now been publicly reported, which is closer to 10,000. But still, the point being, we're a far cry away from a boots-on-the-ground style regime change operation in terms of what we estimate would be required to do so in Venezuela.
That's right. And there's been also some speculation about what special operations forces might do, whether they might do some raids on the ground. They have the capability to do that. The forces in theater are adequate. They have mothership that they can launch from. I don't think they're going to do that because of the risks. Although the risks might be relatively low, there's always a chance of a helicopter crashing or someone being killed or someone being captured, and that would change the political dynamics entirely.
So we'll get to questions specifically about Venezuela. I promise if you're watching this and you're like, you just want to get to the Venezuela point, I want to ask one more question about the counter-narcotics part of this mission. And I want to ask this question. So last week we saw for the first time strikes in the Pacific, right? So that seems to lend some credence to the idea that this is a counter-narcotics campaign, and this is a paradigm that was first tried in the Southern Caribbean, or first displayed, I should say, in the Southern Caribbean, and is now moving to other subregions in the Western Hemisphere. Do you see it that way? How do you see the strikes in the Pacific pulling the mission in a certain direction or reaffirming the mission? How do you read them?
I do, Ryan. You know, the mission, especially at the beginning, was about denying that area to the traffickers and disrupting their activities. And the president himself has identified that that maritime route has been shut off and leading to the next route. What we know for having combated trafficking organizations for a long time is that they're more agile and dynamic than we are. We're a bureaucracy, that they adapt quickly. And one of the things that they do is the eternal balloon effect, that if we go maritime in the Caribbean, they'll go maritime in the Pacific. It's a cat and mouse game. Mm-hmm. If we do maritime, then they'll go overland, or they'll go aerial, or they go container, and so on and so forth. And what it's taught us is that we can't just focus on one tool, one methodology in one area at the time, because all they'll do is they'll shift on us.
So you bring up a very good point, which is that traffickers are adept, they shift. They tend to be one, sometimes multiple steps ahead of the U.S. government. The president has indicated in recent weeks that we're going to, quote, do land soon, by which I think we should interpret that he's considering strikes on land, no longer in international waters, but rather going after cartels on land. What are some of the advantages and pitfalls of the next phase in the counter-narcotics efforts, what the president is calling phase 2 of this? And I'll start with Juan, but I'll also ask Mark for his opinion.
Well, this is also, everything the president's doing is also a trial for what might take place elsewhere. You know, think Mexico or any other place where we need to take care of business. And when we focus on exactly what we can and cannot do, Mark's been very deliberate about talking about those things, those limitations. The enemy gets a vote as well.
Right.
And so the vulnerabilities that represents for us and our resources and what we are willing to pay politically for that or not. And of course in lives. What you have here is a situation that if we can project our power as far away as possible and with a minimum amount of risk to the lives of our citizens, our soldiers, Marines, airmen, naval forces, Coast Guard. What this does is opens up a sort of a very rigid line of response. That being primarily something like Tomahawks, right? We're going to have missile cruisers and submarines and all these things that have all sorts of capabilities that can be fired from far away, place minimum risk in our forces, and exact the kind of damage we would want to do on targets on the ground. I think that's probably the most likely. And I don't want to dismiss anything, but unlike Grenada or the soft invasion of Haiti or Panama, we will not dominate the airspace. Now, the first thing we want to do is we will want to aspire to dominate the airspace, which is do away with their anti-aircraft capabilities and their fighter jets. But other than that, this will be that places limits on our ability to respond at least in the short term. So
precision-guided munitions from a safe distance without putting U.S. Servicemen and women at risk. Say, such as in that graphic that I showed earlier, we have the notional halfway point between Puerto Rico and Caracas. and you have most of the U.S. capabilities within range of pretty much all of Venezuela.
I think it's important to note that geographically, Puerto Rico is, again, in a very good spot. It's only, 500, 600 miles from Venezuela, 30 minutes if you're maybe 30 minutes or less if you're a fighter jet.
Flying in a supersonic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very advantageous and gives us an opportunity to respond quickly if we were to increment the kind of things that we would want to do against Venezuela using other platforms and resources.
Mark, let me go to you. Same question, but specifically honing in on Venezuela, because Juan talked about other theaters as well where this model could apply. But specifically honing in on Venezuela, in your assessment, if the president decides to strike Venezuela, how might he do that?
Well, we talked about invasion and soft.
Right.
I think there's a high likelihood of strikes by missiles long-range precision, as we've been discussing. That could come from the sea. The Tomahawks on board the ships, they're well adapted for that kind of mission. The Tomahawks have a long history. They've been very successful. They could be launched from the air outside of the Venezuelan air defense zone, either by bombers or by some of the fighters. The question is what the target set would be. One target set would be the cartels, and that would encompass production facilities, for example, maybe some port facilities, maybe some safe houses or ship production facilities, these semi-submersibles that the smugglers use. But other targets that would be the Maduro regime. And for that, I think they would strike at the military forces, particularly the air defenses, and likely against some of the regime leadership, maybe trying to hit Maduro himself, and hitting the Ministry of Defense and those kinds of institutions that would support the regime.
Great. This brings up another question from me, and I want to pose this to Juan about the targets, potential targets. We've been trying to think through here at CSIS, trying to get out in front of what could potentially be a strike against Venezuela. What would the target list look like, in your opinion? And what does the target list say about the administration's risk appetite?
Well, Mark did a very good job at explaining some of the initial targets. I would say if you're focusing on pure drug targets, you're looking at clandestine airfields, labs, cache sites for drugs, any infrastructure that the traffickers use and abuse.
But some of those are inevitably government facilities, are they not, since this is a regime that's involved in these activities?
That's exactly the case. What if it's a military airstrip that you permit the traffickers to use, right? So it's a dual use, if you will, application, and makes it fair game. Or if in the leadership of the military that comprises the Cartel de los Soles and those civilians that accompany this, including Maduro himself, anything associated with that, I believe, would probably be fair game. The things we probably wouldn't do, I think, at least early on, infrastructure, like what we normally do in some places, we wouldn't do there. Electricity, dams, those kind of bridges, critical bridges, at least not, as an initial strike.
Mark, I want to ask you a question about an analytical distinction, because when we get into discussions about Venezuela and whether the United States may strike Venezuela, a lot of conversation, of course, revolves around regime change. But that can take many different forms. It can look quite different depending upon how it unfolds. Here at the center, at least in our program, we've been making an analytical distinction between a regime change and regime collapse. Is that a useful analytical distinction, in your opinion, if the U.S. decides to go kinetic on land against Venezuela?
Well, I think it is, because regime collapse implies that we're going to put pressure on the Maduro regime, but we're intending that regime fall apart, that maybe some parts of the military become disaffected, refuse to follow orders, maybe someone actually launches a coup d'etat internally, but then something happens so that the resistance to some U.S. Forces on the ground go away. So the United States could land a relatively small force, take over Caracas, bring in opposition groups, and then get out. The regime change, if they fight, as we noted, that could be 50,000 to 150,000. It's important also to make a distinction between regime change that focuses just on the regime in Caracas and regime change that focuses on the entire country. Because if you want to get all of the drug production facilities, those are way out there in the hinterland. And, as we've heard, some of those, the FARC and some of those other organizations are very tough fighters, and the United States might well end up in the kind of protracted counterinsurgency, peacekeeping operation that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan that, were so unsatisfactory.
And it should be noted in a setting, in a context, jungle warfare, that it hasn't fought in decades, really since Vietnam. Juan, same question to you. Is it a useful analytical distinction to think about regime change versus regime collapse? And if it is, what does regime collapse look like as a theory of change? It involves some kind of outside catalyzation of change within, perhaps involving the precision-guided munitions you discussed earlier?
I do believe that it's a fair analytical distinction. And among the issues that I would look like is what kind of collapse? Are we looking at something like Gaddafi in Libya, right? Or is it like Syria, where it just all of a sudden it just triggers and a collapse and a situation's reversed suddenly? In Venezuela, one of the few institutions that still operates relatively competently is the military. And they're much more insular, not just in the typical way that military may view civilians, but they're more insular in terms of they believe that they carry the flag of the revolution of Chavismo in a different way, and something that's a lot more loyal to the vision of Hugo Chavez. It's quite possible that if they did move in on their own, if something triggered, if they viewed that it was in their best interest, that they could move in with or without U.S. Military kinetic activity in Venezuela. Just the impendingness of it that's what the administration's hoping, right? That just without having to actually go to war, it triggers something and there's a collapse, a change, whether it comes from within or it comes from, some faction in the military, or, Maduro decides to leave on his own. I think it's more likely that the Venezuelan military is an entity that could withstand any change, and as one of the few institutions that actually functions in the country, looks at self-preservation and that of their legacy, and because it doesn't take a brain surgeon to know that when the U.S. invaded, soft invasion of Haiti, they did away with the Haitian military. When they invaded Panama, they did away with the Panamanian military, and so they will want to be co-architects of their own future. And that could be an incentive in and of itself for them to come to some sort of understanding and to take care of business at home without things getting worse. And just to add one point to that, we have to be careful not to repeat mistakes in the Baathification of Venezuela. Yeah. We will absolutely need the Venezuelan military, whether we like it or not, to help us keep peace and to embark Venezuela on a new future.
Indeed, and they have a constitutional function to play, and I think it's also important to note that given the way that the elections went last year, which we know because, of course, the actas, you don't get to 70+% support in the country unless you have a decent amount of support within the military when those folks are in the privacy of the ballot box selecting their choice in the 2024 presidential elections. Let me just ask you as a follow-up, Juan, what do you think the chances of this kind of win without fighting scenario is? I think it would be the ideal for Venezuela. The military decides that it wants to be on the right side of history, comply with the mandate that was given to the opposition in July of last year, move towards greater constitutionalism. I think you cast a bit of doubt on that when you were speaking, but what do you put the percentages of that happening?
I think it may be too aspirational. It may take a little bit of coaxing from the U.S. side in the form of, impending or incipient military action on the side of the U.S. If there's one thing that the regime, after whatever it is, 25 years in power, has learned, is it's learned to build a callus around those things, and they've survived time and time and time again. And in that room, as they're all sitting around the table, there are people who are going to argue, this is just one more chapter that we're going to be able to live through. And others knowing quite well that this is something entirely different, and that the U.S. is using all the tools at its disposal, and that it's intent on making some sort of change take place in Venezuela.
Go ahead, Mark.
I want to add that if the regime were to collapse, it would need to be replaced by something. Now, there is an opposition group. They might be able to come together as an actual government. I've had two experiences in this regard. One was Desert Storm, and I was with the U.S. forces. We threw the Iraqis out. The Kuwaiti government came back in. It was legitimate. It had resources, and it immediately started running the country. U.S. forces could go home. I was also with the invasion forces in 2003. We expelled the Iraqis. There was no viable opposition group. There was no legitimate government that came in, and of course we spent years and years trying to establish a government, and we're only partly successful there. So the first step might be getting rid of the old regime, but then you have to substitute something.
Well, I think it should be noted that the opposition in Venezuela has had a long time to think about this. They are thinking about it. Maria Corina Machado is a strong presence around the world, even though she's doing so from a clandestine location. And I think, furthermore, the recent awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize for her keeps her cause and the Venezuelan opposition's cause front and center for many. Mark, I want to ask a question about the aircraft carrier to the Caribbean. This is not a typical, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday type of situation. This is a pretty irregular type of announcement. One mentioned that some Venezuelan military will understand that this is unprecedented and that this is a different kind of situation, and others won't. That the U.S. is pulling out all the stops. Speaking of pulling out all the stops, the Ford Carrier Strike Group is pretty much all the stops, right? That's kind of the last tool in the toolkit we could reach for in terms of adding more to the force posture in the region. Talk about some of the capabilities that the Carrier Strike Group has and what they might be used for.
Well, this is a very interesting move because it is so unusual, as you note. The United States only has 11 carriers, only about 3 of them at sea at any one time. So to pull one from the Mediterranean, where the Ford was, and bring it to the Caribbean is a major strategic statement, and pulls the carrier away from other regions, where the combatant commanders are asking for it. They all want more aircraft carriers. It brings immense capabilities. The carrier and its escorts, probably 3 destroyers coming with it. The thing is that those capabilities are mostly for power projection, for strikes against ground targets, against other militaries. Not very good for counter-drug. They only have about 19 helicopters and a couple of other aircraft that could be used for surveillance. The fixed wing, which is the backbone of the carrier battle group, they travel much too fast to be very good at surveillance. So this is an asset that's that's extremely valuable, extremely powerful, only so-so at counter-drug, but really good at strikes against forces ashore.
So what does that tell you about the evolving mission set when you heard on Friday of last week, and you put out a quick piece that I would tell listeners to go and find on the CSIS website. What does that tell you about the evolving mission of this deployment?
Well, this is in terms of military capability, as opposed to a political signal.
Yeah.
It's setting you up for operations ashore. It is not enhancing counter-drug capabilities. You also asked about what else in the toolkit could be used. Well, the toolkit, of course, is pretty deep. There are two other things we're watching for. One is tent cities in Puerto Rico, which would indicate reinforcements going to Puerto Rico and a
Right.
force expansion. The other thing is about amphibious ships. There are 3 on station now, but if we saw additional amphibious ships showing up with Marines, that would be another signal that we were building for some sort of strike.
Well, let me ask you a question about the Fort Carrier Strike Group as well. Same question to Mark that I posed to Mark. What's the significance of it? And let me add a second part to that question. Have we crossed a Rubicon here?
Well, undoubtedly, it changes things dramatically. I would have said, Mark may or may not be in agreement, I would have said last week at this time that we probably had sufficient resources in theater to achieve the types of objectives that could be set out either on a counter drug or other kind of mission. Other than in boots on the ground invasion, we have collected between intelligence resources, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance resources, special forces transportation, command and control, and the overwhelming, aerial resources and so forth, that we could probably carry out whatever we've been discussing today without the use of the carrier force, right? The carrier group. So what does it give us? Well, it doesn't give us more troops, right? Actual boots on the ground. It doesn't give us that. But it does give us this overwhelming power projection. It also is a message, right? You don't undervalue the information heft of redeploying a carrier group or a carrier. And it gives us maybe, I don't know what the estimates that we're using, but 40 to 48 additional fighters, which may or may not be necessary, but we could pretty much bet that any commander wants as many resources that he can have and to have as much redundancy and everything else. So that's a huge comfort to the war planners and the executioners in this thing. But the truth is that I think that probably is more than is needed to achieve objectives.
Let me ask you both a perhaps slightly provocative question, but it's based on recent history in the second Trump administration, which was during Operation Midnight Hammer. There was this excellent moment, I think tactically brilliant, where we all paid attention to beat 2 bombers going to Guam. The real action was going in the other direction. There's going to be perhaps an equivalent moment when the carrier strike group, the Fort Carrier Strike Group, passes through the Strait of Gibraltar, out of the Mediterranean, and on its way across the Atlantic to theater. Is there any part of you that thinks this might be a head fake, and it's potentially a tactical distraction as activities are ramping up in the Caribbean? When we start with you, Mark, and then I'll ask you, Juan, to weigh in on the same question.
I mean, it's a great question. I don't think so, just because I can't think of another target except for Venezuela. Now, it may be that everyone's expecting a hiatus here until the fort arrives. It'll probably take about 10 days. So maybe something would happen before then, as everyone is sort of believing that we're in a quiet spot. But it's hard for me to imagine a different target other than Venezuela.
Juan?
I agree with Mark that it'll take, timing's important. It's going to take 10 to 14 days for that carrier. It took them 2 days to leave Croatia, right? The waters off of Croatia as they got everybody back from shore leave and everything. It takes 10 to 14 days. So think of that in terms of, when something could happen. And then think of the president's gone, right? He's in Asia and he's going to be there all this week. And so it doesn't mean he can't get on a plane and come back, but that's probably not what he would want to do, especially if he's in a position to make the decision go, no go on Venezuela. He's under no pressure.
Okay. Quick question about the recent resignation of the Admiral Halsey, who runs Southcom. I think his last day will be December 12th, if I'm not mistaken. What should we read about this, Mark? And is there any sort of operational capabilities that we should think about as being critical to Southcom, or is this, in your opinion, mostly an operation that's being directed from here in Washington?
Well, clearly Washington is deeply involved, and they're working through Southcom and now through this joint task force. Been a lot of questions about the admiral's retirement. Was this one of the firings that the secretary had done for people he thought had been promoted for DEI kinds of reasons? But he gave a very generous statement about the admiral's retirement, about the admiral's contributions to national security, that didn't indicate that this was a firing. It's also possible that there was some sort of operational difference of opinion, the admiral wanting to go in a different direction. I've seen that speculation. But it struck me that if there were differences of opinion like that, he would have left earlier. They would not have left him in place for 2 months, with this disagreement going on. I think we'll see eventually why he's retiring. I wouldn't be surprised if there were just a health issue or a family issue that was forcing him into retirement.
Well, let me ask you a little bit more of a pointed question. You've been involved in multiple operations in the region. How much of this operation, in your opinion, is being directed from here in Washington versus how much of it is being run out of Southcom in Miami?
I think that increasingly we've seen a trend to this, so it wouldn't surprise me. I would also say that it's very complicated for Southcom. It's as Mark indicated, they're not a large command. But they do know the region. They know it well, and they know our partners well. Yeah. And they, in particular, and I think it's worth noting because we haven't brought it up, and they do some phenomenal work. There is a task force that's joint and interagency that does this. It's called Triad of South out of Key West. They didn't just discover, that there are drugs in a country named Venezuela, and so these guys are very good at what they do, and they have partnerships with multiple countries who have representatives from their own forces.
Over 20 of them.
Over 20 at Triad of South, and includes, by the way, the Dutch and the Spaniards and the Brits and the French, who all have a piece of this because they have territories and affiliations to countries in the Caribbean. So for me, my curiosity is, where's the deconfliction? This is a great military word. Deconfliction lie when you bring in, when you declare a new task force, when you already have a task force, and how's that going to play with Southcom in their area of operations? It could get messy, and we'll see how it plays out. I actually, in my mind, I would think that it's more that the MU is going to be more operational, and although they've been described, there's been very, very, very little out on this. Yes. But if they've been described as a place where there'll be, intel comes to reside, and interagency, and even some local agencies, not just federal, and to me that sounds like the model of a joint terrorism task force, and you make the Marines in charge of it. Why? Because they are your capability to reach out and touch someone.
As we bring this event to a close, we only have a few minutes remaining. I want to ask both of you, as analysts, what you're going to be thinking about and looking for moving forward, and if you can, in your answers, give us a sense of timeline. If strikes are to occur, on what kind of timeline? And something we're often reminded of is not only should you plan for the unexpected, you should also consider that the enemy gets a vote, but also Murphy's Law, right? So there's all sorts of things that could go wrong here. Things can happen. It's hurricane season, as Juan has told me multiple times before, in the Caribbean. So maybe if you, in your closing reflection, if you can give us a sense of timeline when you're talking about the things that you are looking for as an analyst in the weeks to come. Why don't we start with you, Mark?
Well, earlier I talked about some of the indicators that I was watching to see if we would continue to build the force up to something that might conduct an invasion, for example. But the movement of the carrier is significant. You can't keep the carrier just circling in the Caribbean waiting for something to happen. Other events will happen around the globe that will demand its presence. The other regional commanders will want it. I think it'll be unlikely to spend a lot of time just hanging around. I think that there will be a lot of pressure when all of these forces come together to do something. The wild card is the enemy and the vote they get. Part of that is Maduro, but part of it is the cartels. So far, the cartels have kept their head down and try to avoid actions that might antagonize the United States. They've clearly continued their drug running. But there are reports out that they've offered money for information, offered money even for the murder of U.S. agents. And if that were to happen, if you were to see cartel hitmen strike U.S. forces, U.S. personnel, then the political dynamics would change substantially. And of course, President Trump was, I think, well known for his desire to strike back, and I think that would give him tremendous incentives to unleash the forces.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. Juan, I'll give you the final word.
Certainly, Ryan, the clock's ticking. The clock's ticking on this operation. Well, you have preparations that continue, such as we had just had last weekend, the weekend before last, Red Horse, the Air Force's unit, reinforcing airstrips and tarmacs and aprons in the airport in Ceiba. That gives you an idea that they're looking to the long term. You don't bring in a unit like this, do those sorts of improvements for something that's just going to be transitory. You saw that in the other side of the island, in the Rafael Hernandez Airport, that former Ramey, is that they've built bunkers to store ammo for the Reapers. That's something that should telegraph our intentions. And then, of course, and I agree with Mark with everything. You can't leave these resources in perpetuity out there. We're talking, I think, more weeks and months. And young Marines get bored. They lose their edge. You start having morale problems and seasickness and disciplinary issues, and our readiness level starts to decline a bit, and then you have rotations, and pilots rotate, and aircraft rotate, and maintenance, and all those things that we don't think about that we need to think about. The fact that we haven't fought a jungle war in a couple of generations, that matters. And those kinds of things, I think the clock's ticking. We're going to have to do something sooner or later, or shift and change what we're doing in the region. And as Mark pointed out, we're not going to leave an aircraft carrier out there forever. It's going to achieve its objectives and move on. And we haven't talked about anything like the parts of fighting this thing that accompany kinetic activity and prepare the battlefield, such as information warfare and cyber and all the other menu of things that are taking place today. In preparation for if we have to go kinetic. So and as Mark said, the enemy gets a vote. What happens if they move forward and they attack Trinidad, right? Because it's the base for something happening, or invade Guyana. What happens then? Because do we expect them just to sit there and wait for us to attack? That's a question you need to be asking yourself.
It's a great place to end. There's so much more we could have discussed. Obviously, this is a fluid, very dynamic, fast-moving situation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Juan Cruz, Senior Advisor with the CSIS Americas Program, Mark Hansian, Senior Advisor with the Defense and Security Department here at CSIS. That concludes our event. Thank you so much for tuning in. Continue to check CSIS for near-daily updates on this very, very important development in the Southern Caribbean, as multiple programs here at the Center stay very abreast of this situation. Thank you very much.